On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give a portion to his wife, Peninnah, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival used to provoke her severely, to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? This is a husband trying really hard, by the way, right? This is a husband trying really hard. After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazirite. Until the day of his death he shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved. Her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. But Hannah answered him, No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I am speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time. Then Eli answered, Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your sight. Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I have asked him of the Lord. This is God's good word for us, God's beloved people. Thanks be to God. So, we are continuing our series of Keeping the Faith. Today, obviously, looking at the story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel. This series takes seriously. The Bible is not full of stories of happy times and how happy people saw God in happy times. No, it's a story of a whole lot of very troubled times and how deeply troubled people found God in the midst of troubled times. And I don't know about y'all, but for me, that sounds a lot like our world today sometimes. We live in troubled times, and so we need to take seriously the ways that God talks to us and has talked to God's people in similarly troubled times. Before we kind of dig more into Hannah's story, I want us to think a little bit about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement that kind of reaches its culmination in 1964 with the passing of the Civil Rights Act. But I want us to broaden our scope of this for a second and think about the more or less 100-year time period from the Emancipation Proclamation in the mid-1860s to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the mid-1960s. It was 100 years where not much seemed to happen, where not much seemed to get better. So a whole bunch of stuff got better all at once because slavery stopped being a thing. That, my friends, is a very good thing. But then the brakes really hit, right? And for 100 years, African Americans, particularly in the South, had to live with the inequity of the Jim Crow laws, the separate but equal. Yeah, okay. That's how that worked. The fear that all those structures set up to protect people from violence would not stop racial violence from being committed against them. And on top of that, just the daily degradation wearing down on the soul day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, of knowing that you are being treated and regarded as less than. I know how much I hate being pat on the head for looking like a 12-year-old, and then you amplify that by about 1,000 times. I can only imagine, right? The just daily personal degradation of what it was to live in that world for 100 years, for 3 or 4 generations of people suffering in the midst of the same grind that never seemed to get better. Then you think about it on the national scale, you have a whole bunch of suffering. You have people willing to have violence inflicted upon them, and a deep clinging to hope where there seemed to be no hope. It seemed impossible because movement never seemed to happen. If anything, it only ever seemed to get worse. For 100 years, they had to cling to hope and cling to faith that God would act on their behalf. It was also a movement bathed in a soundtrack of prayer. The spirituals that generations before had supported their ancestors in the midst of the brutal fields of slavery for the civil rights movement became their prayer for a hope of a better world. Go down, Moses, go down to Egypt land, tell all pharaohs, all of them, let my people go. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. And that someday did come, at least to a certain extent. God did act in history. Through people great and small, things did change. But it took 100 years of prayer and 100 years of clinging to hope and 100 years of keeping the faith through that soundtrack of prayer. Because those prayers went to a God that does hear and a God that does care. There's a lot of this reflected in Hannah's story here in the first chapter of the book of Samuel, right? Hannah's got it rough, okay? So Hannah is one of 2 wives. The other wife in this relationship is not a nice person. Right? Husband, Elkanah, great. He's a nice guy. He's trying really hard. It's not his fault he married a dud. One good, one dud. Batting 50% is pretty good. If you have a 500 batting average, you're doing all right. But Ruth is getting emotionally abused by this other wife repeatedly for years. And the key issue is that Hannah is unable to have children. She's unable to bear kids, which in the ancient world is a really big problem. You see, she would go to the tabernacle at Shiloh every year. Things always get worse around the holidays. She would go to the tabernacle at Shiloh every year, be constantly reminded by this other wife, mocked and all of that. You can't have kids. That's how it went, I'm sure. She's a dud. What can I say? And she would be reminded that from the perspective of the society that Hannah lived in, she is a failure. Okay, I want to pause. Did this last week. We're going to do this again. In the 21st century, women are valued for many things, right? Having kids, just one among them. Great, massive intellectual achievements in business in all fields, right? Do not walk away from this sermon saying, Pastor Trey thinks women's role is only childbirth. Do not. If I see that on social media after this, I will deny it, because it is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we've made a lot of progress in 3,000 years, but 3,000 years ago, that's the society Hannah lived in. That her core job was to produce children. Again, that was then, not now. And she was not able to. And so she, in the eyes of her society, which her sister wife will remind her constantly, means she's a failure and pushes her to the margins of her society. Not by her husband. Her husband, Bible's clear, husband's a good man, right? Cares for her, even in the midst of her struggle. Even tries to offer emotional support, which was really rare for husbands 3,000 years ago. Less rare now, but it was really rare 3,000 years ago. And makes his sacrifices every year. He's a good, godly man trying the best he can. That doesn't make up for the fact that he married a dud who is making Hannah's life miserable and reminding her of her failure and her marginalization. So what does Hannah do? How does Hannah keep the faith? Short answer to that is Hannah prays deeply and faithfully and without reserve. As it says in 1 Samuel 1:10, she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She goes to just outside the inner sanctum of the temple where she was, or the tabernacle where she was not allowed to go. She just falls down before the Lord and begins praying and weeping and just praying deeply, fervently, handing it all over to God, telling God exactly how she feels. And priest Eli is sitting just off to the side, as the painting we saw a minute ago showed, sitting just off the side, watching all this. And she's praying so deeply that, words kind of fail her, right? And in the ancient world, you didn't pray in your head. You only prayed out loud. How many of y'all nowadays we pray in our heads, right? At least I do. Maybe I'm the only one. Sometimes I wander around this place talking to myself, and what I'm actually doing is talking to God. But most of the time I'm praying in my head. It's embarrassing. But she just, probably from the crying, whatever, her voice is hoarse. She stops saying it out loud. She's just moving her lips. That's fervently she's praying. Eli, not a great priest, looks at her and goes, she's drunk. That's what's happening. Definitely drunk. This is a problem. Lady, stop making this drunken spectacle. You're not helping yourself. I would have hit him. She doesn't. Instead, she hits him with words and logic. And it says in verses 15 and 16, but Hannah answered his accusation of drunkenness. No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I am speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time. My absolute favorite line of that is, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. She is reaching down deep into her heart and laying all of that pain and hurt at the feet of God. This isn't like nice little side of the eye crying, right? This is ugly crying before God, speaking deeply about how she hurts. And God hears her. And God responds. And even in the half-hearted words of peace that Eli gave her, yeah, God hears you, she walks away made whole. Because she knows she's handed it over to God. And she knows that God is big enough to handle what she has handed over to the Lord. And it does end up. God does act. God does give her Samuel. And Samuel goes on to be a great man. And she keeps her promise, right? This is her only kid. And yet she's willing to give him to the Lord as she promised, right? She shows that she is a great woman of faith and continues to be. So part of this is talking about on a personal level what it means, her one faithful act, how she keeps her faith. The one action she gets in this scene is how she prays to God, right? The rest of it's set dressing, setting up why she needs to pray and setting up the result of her prayers. The core action that she takes is this deeply faithful, unrestricted prayer to God. But this also, much like the civil rights movement, isn't just about a personal level. It works on a much larger level. It works on the level of the nation, in fact. Okay, so we got to do this very short 2-minute journey through biblical history. Okay, so world was created, right? We're good? Yeah. Okay, at some point, we end up in Egypt. We good so far? Remember, end up in Egypt in slavery. Okay, then Moses shows up. Well, Moses kills the guy, then comes back, but whatever. Moses arrives, sets them free from Egypt. They wander in the desert. We good so far? Okay, then they arrive in the promised land. Moses dead on the mountain. Joshua now in charge, conquers the land for the people. Okay? After that comes the time of the judges. Time of the judges doesn't go well. Okay? The book of Judges is structured in cycles. They're doing okay. They stop doing okay. God sends a judge. They start doing okay again. They stop doing okay. God sends a judge. They start doing okay again. God sends a judge. It's a cycle, right? Read the book of Judges. It's remarkably repetitive. But if you dig deep into the book of Judges, it's not getting better. It's getting worse. It is devolving, not evolving, right? They are not climbing a mountain, they are bouncing down a mountain into a pit. Book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, it's two books. We have it as two books. It's really written as one. The books of Samuel take place right after the book of Judges, meaning that we've picked up at a real low point in the history of God and his people. In fact, the book of Judges ends with this really weird, ambivalent, not nice ending. Book of Judges chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. Very key phrase, in their own eyes, right? Who thinks that was a good thing? Yeah, no, it was bad, right? They were not doing what was right in the eyes of God. They were making it up for themselves. They had wandered from who they were supposed to be and found themselves disconnected from God. When God hears Hannah's cry, God answers Hannah's plea. But God also answers the call of the nation to live right again. You see, Samuel in his ministry does two incredibly important things. He anoints both of the first kings of Israel, Saul, which goes and David, which goes much better, and sets up this great line that eventually leads to Christ himself, right? That is kicked off by Samuel's ministry in the world. Samuel, not David, is the beginning of the turning point. David's the one who establishes firmly the turning point. But it starts not with the king, but with the prophet. The prophet is the one that speaks to God, speaks for God. The king is the one that listens to God, right? It starts with this God speaker, this prophet Samuel. So you see both God working on the small level, one woman, one plea, one child, the answer to a fervent prayer. But you also see God working on the much larger level, a nation in need of redemption, a path prophet coming out of that need and beginning the process of God saving God's people on the high level and on the small level. We see God in action. All because Hannah kept the faith, prayed fervently. So the first thing for us, this is one of those, this is the turn in the sermon where we go, okay, that's great, preacher, man, that's cute, now what? So here's the now what. The first thing is pour out your heart to the Lord, right? Don't pray to God the way you talk to your family at the holidays, right? And I'll show you what I mean, okay? And we're all about to do this, so no one look at me like, I don't do this. I guarantee this is going to happen to many of us very soon. We are going to see family we do not see much. They will ask you, how are you? To which you will respond, I'm fine, right? Yeah. I have many acronyms for what fine means. None of them are church appropriate. It begins with an F, y'all. The nicest one I have is freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional, right? We're not fine. And you don't have to pretend to be fine with God. right? You may have to pretend to be fine with Aunt Susie. Yeah, no, that's probably the thing, because you really probably don't want the crazy woman in on your emotional business, right? You probably do not want to unload on your mean family members. That's just not a thing. I get it. Oh, trust me, I get it.
Your family doesn't watch this, do they?
No. Yes, they do, but not the ones I'm talking about. You know what I'm saying, though. That is not how we need to treat God, and I suspect that's how a lot of us treat God, right? That we don't really want to bring our business to God. We don't really want to show God how we're really feeling, because God might judge us. Look, God's already going to judge us right or wrong. This is how God works, but God also loves us and redeems us. This story does not end with Hannah getting zapped into a hole there on the tabernacle floor, right? That is not and Hannah cried out to God with all of her emotion, and then God smiteth Hannah there in the moment. Zap! That's not what, I don't know if y'all are paying attention, that is not what happened. Hannah's prayer is answered. Hannah's fervent, unrestricted prayer was answered. You see, when we hold back in our prayers to God, we're actually doubting God and putting a barrier between our relationship, a barrier between us and God, right? I want to put a barrier between me and the family members to which I am not close to. It's part of my survival in this family. We should not do that with God. Because when we hold back from God, we're putting a barrier there that makes it even harder for us to keep the faith, because we forget how much God loves us. We forget how big God is, that God's the biggest kid out there. God can handle whatever we throw at God, and God has probably heard worse. We can tell our true selves to God. To hold that back is to create an artificial barrier between us and God that does not need to be there, an artificial barrier that just makes it even harder for us to keep the faith. Pour out your heart to the Lord. That was Hannah's core faithful act. Pour out your heart. Let God's love pour back in. Don't let a barrier come between you. Second thing to remember is that God cares about the very tall and the very small. This is the Dr. Seuss line. The very tall and the very small, right? Yes, God is deeply involved in the grand shape of history. God was involved in the civil rights movement, I firmly believe, right? God is trying desperately to speak to world leaders all the time, right? God does care about the big people of this world, of which I am certainly not, right? But God also cares on the smallest of scales. So often I hear, I don't want to pray to God about that. God doesn't need to hear that. Yes, God does. God loves you that much. Yes, God cared about the grand scope of Israel's history and making sure that people came back, but he also just cared that this woman that was being abused by her sister wife was able to find wholeness, right? Hannah was not a grand person. She was the wife of a moderately wealthy guy, right? She's a nobody. But God cared deeply for her. And God cares deeply for us, whether we are grand world leaders, movers and shakers, or not. But if any of y'all are, we need to talk. I have some thoughts. But God cares on the very big scale, absolutely. But God cares about everything that you carry with you. Every burden you carry in your heart, you can lay before the Lord. The joyous thing about God is you literally cannot waste God's time. God is time itself. God got all the time. Your therapist may clock out after an hour, but God never closes. Thank God. The last thing is, and this is a reminder we need a lot, and so I make this reminder a lot, God works in the very big and the very small. God is working in the course of our world. It may not feel that way right now. We may look around the world and not see it. But we have to have faith that God is there. We have to see how God has worked in our lives in the small scale and realize what that means for our world on the big scale. In saving Hannah, in giving Hannah what she needed, God also saved God's people. It's remarkable what God can do, especially when we all keep the faith.